Ah, dang it. Forgot to put on my flannel. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the show. And that's right, today we are getting our beard wax on, we're getting our flannel on, and we're checking out the Triumph Bonneville. But we're not just checking out any Bonneville, we're checking out my favorite subcategory. This is the Thruxton 900. However, this one's kind of unique because it's the 900. It's not the 1200, it's not the Thruxton R, which makes this actually a really great option if you're looking for a beginner bike that also has that awesome cafe racer flair. But with all that being said, let's hit the road and let's see what the Thruxton is all about.
All right, hitting the twisties on the Thruxton here. The first thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and clear up a slight misconception that all Thruxtons are sporty. That's definitely a thing I ran into. I definitely looked at the Thruxton as the sporty Bonneville. It's really not until you get to the R, I guess. It's still doing great. It's still doing just fine. But if you're looking for that, like, you know, sort of true cafe racer with more emphasis on racer and less on cafe, you're going to want to look to the Thruxton R. So, let's talk about the Thruxton 900 here in the Twisties. So the first thing I'm going to say is the front brake is not good. And let me caveat that slightly by saying it is doing the job, but it is doing no more than that. It does not impress me. It's kind of a numb lever feel. I think you could improve it slightly, and we'll talk about that more later, but I think we're dealing with bad hardware and not necessarily bad consumables. The next thing, that front tire, it's a little bit slower side to side, and because this bike has a decent weight, it's definitely more ponderous side to side, but it's not like Harley ponderous where you really have to work it from side to side. This will do it, it just doesn't do it as quickly as, you know, say a naked bike does. However, when you get this thing on the side of the tire at the speeds that it likes to do it, you know, say 5/10, 6/10 speeds, it's so nice. It feels great. There's something so fun about being on one of these classic bikes and going through the twisties. You really do feel like you're going back in time a little bit. And I love that. I absolutely love that. It's a great, I don't know, you can really only get this feeling from riding a Bonneville. Now let's talk about the motor real quick. The motor is good. It feels really happy between 4,000 and 5,000 RPM. You get it above 5,000 RPM and you do have some good power, but you gotta wonder why. Like, why am I revving it that high? It feels... mechanical sympathy steps in. You want to shift a little bit earlier. You want to keep this bike in the mid-range where the torque is. It's more of a torquey motor than a horsepower motor. And personally, I kind of enjoy that riding style. I like being in the middle of the power band versus tippy top. It's a Bonneville. There's something about riding a Bonneville through the hills and being able to look around, you know? It's more about the experience of... man, it's so hard to say this stuff without sounding like an absolute freaking hipster, but I think it just goes with the territory. I'm gonna come out and say it. It's more about the experience, man. It's the experience, it's not the bike performing, man. It's what you're doing. It's being out in nature and enjoying everything around you. There is kind of that sense of fun wonder to this bike. And when you ride it like that, a lot of the flaws that I find on the twisty road, they sort of go away, you know? You can compensate for bad tires by adding just a little bit more body English, you know? You're not leaning as far, but you're having some fun. You're feeling like you're going fast when you're not really. And I think that really makes this such a fun beginner option. It's great on a twisty road as long as you're not demanding it to be a sport bike. It looks sporty, but it's not a sport bike. And when you don't ride it like a sport bike, it's so happy. And I know a lot of people get into motorcycling because they want to go fast and they want to feel the wind through their hair, but there is something to the more laid back, chilled out style where, again, I hate to say it, you're here for the experience. You can't get on one of these and not start talking like a hipster. Not possible. But that's the twisty road experience. So let's pull this thing over and start talking about the specs, because despite being a 900cc parallel twin, this thing isn't exactly as competitive as you might expect.
So jumping into the specs on this thing, it's got a 865cc air and oil cooled parallel twin. This motor's putting down 68 horsepower and about 53 foot-pounds of torque. And apparently it weighs in at 451 pounds wet and ready to ride. However, I don't buy it. It's probably one of those Triumph numbers where they sort of fudged it a little bit. It does feel relatively light. It doesn't feel as heavy as my Grezzo, but the way it rides feels a lot heavier. And I think part of that might be down to this bigger front tire, but that's besides the point. Let's mount up on this thing and talk about some of the ergonomics, because it looks pretty aggressive when you're sitting on it. The handlebars are low and they're kind of flat, so you do have a bit of a cant forward at the waist, and the pegs are kind of high. But the reality is this is not a particularly uncomfortable motorcycle, and I haven't felt any wear in my wrists. My butt is nice and comfortable on this wide seat, and the area here beneath my hips is a little bit cramped, but it's not too bad, honestly. You got a 31.1 inch seat, which can be a little bit tall, but because it's so narrow between the knees, you can really get your feet down easily on this thing. This is a really approachable motorcycle. But that leads me into my pros and cons on this thing. And the first pro definitely is the motor. Now, I could see this being a con for some folks. This thing is not creating a lot of power. It just isn't. It's a very lazy, very low compression motor that likes to just cruise. And this motor does exactly what I want it to do. And because it's not so juiced up, this is a great option for somebody who's looking to get into motorcycling for the first time. It's got more power than something like the Royal Enfield, but it delivers it in a nice, smooth, linear fashion that you're not gonna get out over your skis on. A definite black mark for this motorcycle, though, is the front brake feel. We do only have one disc, and that's all it needs because it's not going that fast, but the master cylinder just does not feel good. I've been riding it around all day, hoping that I would change my opinion on this, and I really haven't. My guess here is that we are just dealing with poor hardware. You might be able to improve it with pads and fluid. I've said that before, I'll say it again. I still think that we are let down somewhat by bad internals on this master cylinder. Another serious pro for me, the looks. This thing is just drop dead gorgeous, especially when you have the cowl on, which I don't have on because I had to take it off because it's covered in grime, but that's besides the point. This thing is a great looking motorcycle. It definitely looks like something out of the 60s, out of the 70s, even though it's got the modern trimmings of a fuel-injected motorcycle. And to be honest, the first time I saw this thing, I looked at the carburetors, the intake situation here, and I thought those were carburetors. I swear to God, I thought those were carburetors on there, because I looked it up and I knew it was EFI, but I had to ask the sales guy. I was like, "Are you sure that's not a carburetor? It looks just like the one off of my DRZ." It's nuts. Last pro on this thing, because Triumph has made a bazillion of these throughout the years, and because they have such interchangeable parts, they're cheap. This thing costs $5,700 at AF1 right now. And all of the parts on here in the motor, they're interchangeable between the other 865cc bikes. You can just swap them in like Legos. It's great. These are so cheap. They're so easy to run. And even if you miss this bike right here, you are gonna find more Bonnevilles that are in great shape, round about $5,500, which is the perfect starting amount for your first bike. But with all that being said, let's get this thing out on the highway and see how it behaves on a big old slab of American concrete.
Man, it is crazy. Pulling away on a bike from 2018 that really feels more like a bike from, I don't know, 1980. It's wild. There's so much about this bike that is just so old school in a delicious way, and I absolutely love it. But we need to talk about this bike on the highway because there's a lot to say about a 900cc bike that's only making some 65 odd, 69 odd horsepower, and weighs as much as this thing does. I was talking with the guys at AF1, and they have to move these bikes in and out of the shop all the time, pretty much every day that they are, you know, working, because they need to put the used bikes out front. And the guys were like, I don't know what they made this thing out of, but it is the heaviest bike they have in the shop. And they've got some heavy bikes in there. It just feels very substantial. And on the highway, you really do feel that substantiality to it. It feels like it's not going to get blown around whatsoever, no matter how fast you're going or no matter how fast the wind is blowing. But, you know, as Ron White said, it does not matter how fast the wind is blowing, it is what the wind is blowing. That being said, it ain't blowing this thing around, which is really nice. However, the biggest question mark is not how comfortable it is, at least not in my opinion. It really comes down to, does this bike have the guts to do real good highway work? Because if you've ever ridden one of these Triumphs, you really know that the top gear, it's just a massive, massive overdrive, and there's only 5 forward gears. You know, you tap it out in 5th gear, how does it feel? Well, I can say right now, cruising at about 75 mile an hour in top gear, it's a little bit buzzy, but not very. You know, they've got these nice big cushy grips on here, but there is still a pretty decent high frequency vibration that you get with a lot of parallel twins. This one's basically no different. As far as passing power in 5th gear, nope. Nothing. So there is that Traverse, wide open throttle. I mean, there's something there, but it is not at all instant. If you're looking for power on the highway, you really need to not be in that overdrive gear. However, I am poodling along and I'm doing just fine. The seat's wide and comfortable. Obviously, we're not getting a lot of wind protection despite having this little fairing. And it's hitting me in the chest, which I prefer, because being hit in the chest means that the wind blast is cleaner around my head. And I would take more hits to the chest so that my head is clean and not getting bounced around. Beyond that, there's really nothing to write home about. There's no cruise control, there's none of that stuff. It's just you and a throttle cable and some, well, one brake up front and one brake in the rear. So technically 2 brakes, but you know what? I don't really need anything more from this bike. It feels great. It's one of those situations where you have everything you need and nothing you don't, and I appreciate that. So with all of that being said, let's pull this bike over and let's have the Discord boys ask some questions about ye oldie, well, not ye oldie, but ye oldie looking Thruxton here. See what they have to say and see if we can't answer a couple of questions for them.
Alrighty folks, time for my favorite part of these reviews. It's the Discord question and answer. And if you would like to participate in future reviews, all you gotta do is click the link down in the description below and check out the Patreon. Over there, you can get yourself early access to videos, you can get yourself behind the scenes looks, instant access to the Discord server, and it is the best way to support what I'm doing here on the channel. And with that out of the way, let's dive on into the questions here, with the first one coming to us from Whitney Farted, who is definitely Corgi. Would the Thruxton have allowed the Redcoats to win in 1776? Well, assuming that this was around in 1776, we'd also have to realize that the Sportster would have been around in 1776. So the question is, Thruxton versus Sportster. Sportster. Sorry, Whitney doesn't. It was the Dask-apocalypse before, now it's the Whitney-apocalypse. Anyway, Whitney doesn't. What is the profession of the person who should buy one of these? Barista, guy who works in a one of those ye olde barber shops that has the like spinny pole out front that has all the combs and the barbasol and the chairs that lean back and gives you a razor shave. If you are a microbrewer, you definitely want one of these bikes. Somebody in finance who wants to seem like they're cool. Honestly, just about anybody could get away with riding one of these. They're so much fun, and they're really nice bikes. Patzilla, does the Thruxton thrust nicely? Not really. It doesn't really take off. It doesn't. It's never gonna wow you with its power. But I think that's what makes it such a great beginner bike. More butter. With all that chrome, does the Thruxton rust nicely? I have heard reports that these things do generate rust in weird places, so you probably want to store it inside. Honestly, I think it could look good with a little bit of patina, frankly. Helps it look a little older, I guess. Maybe a little bit more authentic. I think this is the second one from Whitney Doesn't. Who should not buy this bike? Who is it absolutely, undoubtedly not for that might be thinking about it? That's actually a really good question. If you are thinking about this because you've heard that the Thruxton is the sporty Bonnevilles, a lot like me, I'd actually ridden a Thruxton R before, and I just kind of assumed that all Thruxtons were sporty. This is not a sporty motorcycle. It can be ridden in a sporty way, but it's not sporty. So if you're trying to get that old classic sport, like true cafe racer, then this is not your bike. This is definitely more of a cruiser. But other than that, if you're a beginner and you just want a nice looking bike, definitely. Whitney Doff, is there any meaningful difference between this and the Bonnie, the T100? Meaningful difference? I don't think so. It's got flat handlebars. It's got bar and mirrors. Let's be real, they're kind of samey motorcycles, but the Thruxton just, the way it looks speaks to me more than just the regular Bonnie. This one's got a little bit more joie de vivre about it, shall we say. And then last up, we've got a question from Don ATX. How does it compare to the RE Continental GT? That's actually a really good question, and I think we're gonna go handle that in my wrap up, talking about what makes this such a great beginner option versus something like the Royal Enfield, which a lot of people look at as the cheaper version of something like this. Let's hit the road and talk about it.
So starting to round out my thoughts here on the Thruxton 900 from Triumph. This is such a sweet ride, dude. It's such a sweetheart. I absolutely love this thing. It's just nice. It's just a great bike. You could do so much worse if you're looking for a just a nice classic styled cafe racer retro bike. You could do so much worse. I would take this over an XSR 700. I would take this over an XSR 900 if I'm looking for, you know, that sort of retro vibe. Yeah, it's not as potent, obviously, as either of those bikes, but this is the real deal. It's not perfect, obviously. I mean, we talked about the brakes in the Twisty Road segment and a little bit on the highway. They're functional, if not exactly the most confidence-inspiring brake lever ever. It's heavy, you know, it can be a lot, especially if you're moving it around in a garage. And then it's a little slow, you know? It might be a bike you end up growing out of if you want something that's got a little bit more get up and go, a little bit more zest. However, I think that is what makes this such a great beginner option. If I were starting out today, if this was my first ride on a motorcycle and I was looking for a classic bike, because you can get these things so cheap, why would you look anywhere else? I mean, yeah, the Royal Enfields are really nice. Don't get me wrong. The Royal Enfields are great motorcycles. I've ridden both the INT and the Continental 650s. They're both very good motorcycles, but they have a lot of the same problems that this thing does. The front brake on the Royal Enfields are terrible, and they're not very potent either. This has more power than the Royal Enfields do. This is also the genuine article, you know? Why get the copy if you can get the real thing? Especially if you can find the real thing like this in great shape for about the same price out the door. I mean, it's such a great option. Now, if you were going to get this as your beginner bike, the first thing that I would end up doing is I would address the brakes. You have to address the brakes on this, but that can be done fairly cheaply. All you got to do, drain the fluid, slap some new pads on there. If that doesn't do it, you can get a little bit fancier with a new master cylinder, but it can be a bit of a problem based on the way all of this is set up. But honestly, the brake feel is less important if you're just starting out. I would just do pads, and I would just do fluid, and then I would call it a day. The other thing, I would get an exhaust. I don't know why you wouldn't get an exhaust for this as like the first mod. How has this been 21,577 miles on the road with the stock exhaust? These things sound so good with a nice, I don't know, like a Zard exhaust on there. They sound awesome. Last thing, definitely get some stickier rubber. You definitely need a nicer tire. This is adequate. I would at least run the tire till you need to replace it. But don't just go with the OEM rubber. Try to change it out for something that's a little bit better. The front wheel might make things a little bit difficult for finding that correct tire option, but you know, a little bit of research and you'll find exactly the right tire. You're going to go through plenty of them, so you'll be able to take some time to find the right match for you. Beyond all that, don't do a damn thing other than just ride the snot out of this bike. You should just go have fun. This is such a fun bike. I absolutely love it. And for the price point, you can do so much worse. Let's have a little bit of fun here, shall we? Going down a nice road, crossing some rivers, on a cool January day, feeling all Britishy. Oh, it's so nice. This is such a fun bike. It's got so much charm. So much charm. This is, without a doubt, the Bonnevilles are my favorite Triumphs. Period, full stop, end of story. There is no better Triumph than a Triumph Bonneville. And with that, guys, I'm going to call it a day. Remember, if you want to check out this exact bike right here, click the link down in the description below. Check out AF1. They've got all kinds of awesome bikes in the shop. And they've also got Moto Guzzi's, which is another great option if you're looking for that sort of classic-inspired twin. All sorts of fun bikes over at AF1, and they are an awesome dealership. I've bought 2 motorcycles there in the last year, and both experiences were great. It's not your average dealership. And with that, I'm going to call it a day. Let me know your thoughts on the Thruxton, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See you later.